Sturkey, and welcome to Simple Spiritual Practices. In each episode of this podcast, we'll talk about one tangible practice that will help you know yourself and God better. Most of these practices can be done in 5 minutes or less, so you can easily try it out today. If you are ready to experience real growth in your life, or if you want fresh ideas on how to approach your time with God, this podcast is for you. Around this time of year, I tend to get pretty reflective about life in general, the past year, what I want the next season of life to look like. I think it's a combination of the end of the year approaching, plus the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights just makes me feel a little pensive. It's a time of year that while it can be busy and full, it also feels like regular life stops in some ways, even if it's just because I have that holiday feeling that makes me want to do nothing but watch cheesy Christmas movies and eat holiday M&Ms. Now, I know that they're really no different from regular M&Ms other than the red and green color on the shell, but they still feel different, and the Christmas season for me is just not complete without them. But there's just something about this time of year that makes me want to pour a cup of coffee and sit in front of the Christmas tree with my journal and take stock of my life. Now, depending on your personality, that may or may not sound inviting to you, but there's just something about this time of year that makes me want to slow down and reflect on life. Now, I'm not talking about end of the year goal setting here. That's also something we might do at this time of year that could be helpful depending on how you approach it, which is probably a discussion for another episode maybe. But what I'm talking about is simply reflecting on life, looking back at where you've been and noticing where you are now. Not looking towards the future, not yet anyway, but looking at the past and noticing the present. Now, in a year like this one, maybe the only reflection you have about 2020 is that you're grateful it's almost over. And I totally get that. But I also know that if ever there was a year that we need to notice what has taken place around us and within us, it's this year. So, before we close out the year, let's take time to pay attention to what it's taught us, how we've grown, and even how we've struggled. Because no matter how well you think you walked through this tough year, you made it. You survived, you got through, you're still here, and you're probably still doing the basic functions of day-to-day life. And in a year like this, that is saying a lot. Because none of us have walked this year perfectly. And because of the weird, crazy, really tough year that it's been, hopefully it's easier than ever to give ourselves some grace for the ways that we've fallen short. Because always we begin again. Tomorrow is a new day, and soon it will be a new year, another opportunity to receive grace to start again, even multiple times a day. We are invited to receive God's mercies that are new every morning. There is always an opportunity for a fresh start, and that's not limited to the new year. So do you remember back in March when all of this pandemic stuff was new, when we were determined to make the most of this season and take advantage of the time at home and with our families? I think all of us have kind of gone between the extremes of feeling determined to make the most of this time, then swinging all the way to the other side of just feeling kind of a sense of resignation, where all we do is try to get through the day using whatever coping mechanisms are at hand. But since March, the weeks have stretched into months, and now here we are at the end of 2020, and we are still in the midst of a pandemic. And honestly, it's kind of weird that all of this doesn't feel so weird anymore. It's like the initial shock of it all has worn off in a lot of ways. And depending on where you live and your life circumstances with work or your kids' school, life is at varying degrees of being in your normal routine. But for all of us, life looks very different now than it did this time last year. But whatever circumstances you're in now, it's important to acknowledge the enormity of what has happened this year, what we have lost, the grief we've had to carry, the fears and anxiety that we've experienced. And I wonder if so many of us are just feeling so done with this year that we'll be tempted to try and move forward without looking back. That we won't want to think about what's happened this year because we're just so ready to move on. Even now in this episode, you might feel resistance rising up. You don't want to talk about the pandemic anymore. You don't want to reflect on this year. You just want to move forward. And believe me, I get that. But before we move on, if we move forward without looking back, we will miss seeing some of the beautiful things that have happened this year, even in the midst of struggle and the hard moments. And in some cases, the beautiful things have not been despite the hard moments, but because of them. There are gifts to be received here, things to notice, if we will stop just for a few minutes and pay attention to them. So, since this podcast is all about 5-minute practices, I want to challenge you to take just 5 minutes to reflect on 2020. That's it. You don't have to spend hours or do an all-day retreat or anything. Although I do think looking back is worth some longer reflection if you're up for it, but 5 minutes is a great place to start. Now, if you're like me and you love sitting in front of the Christmas tree, journal in hand as you ponder your life for a stretch of time, go for it. But at least give 2020 5 minutes, just 5 minutes of some thoughtful reflection. Notice what needs to be left behind and maybe a few things that you just might want to carry forward as you move into 2021. I'm going to give you some questions to consider as you spend time reflecting on this past year. Now, these questions are simply prompts to help you reflect and remember 2020 to kind of identify what stands out to you. Some of them might resonate with you and others might not, and that's fine. Don't feel like you have to answer all of them. And if you are just going to spend 5 minutes, you are not going to be able to get through all of them anyway, and that's fine. Just pick one that resonates with you the most and see where it takes you. Some of the questions are just kind of general end-of-year questions, and then I'm going to give you a few pandemic-specific ones as well, because in this year that we've had, I think it's worth reflecting on that part of 2020 specifically as we look back. So as I share these questions, I'm going to give you just a few examples of how you might answer just to give you some ideas. And this week on social media, if you're listening to this episode when it releases, I'm actually going to share a few of my own responses to a few of these questions. And if you're willing, I'd love for you to maybe jump on and share your responses there as well. I'm going to do that on Instagram and Facebook. My profile on both of those is just my first and last name, Lindsay Sturkey, or you can find the links to those in the show notes as well. But whether or not you share your responses with anyone at all, I'd encourage you take just 5 minutes and either think through one or more of these questions, or you might even write down a few of your answers as you process them, maybe in just a list of bullet points. And as a reminder, I have all of these questions listed in the show notes. I have them on my website, or you can sign up to receive a free printable through email so that you have this to reference as you look back on your own later. So question number 1 is, what was the high point of 2020? Is there a moment or event that stands out, something that happened that you're grateful for and want to remember? Take time to name what was good about this year. It can be as general or as specific as you want. Question 2, what was the low point of 2020? So maybe this is an obvious question. It's probably something to do with the global pandemic, but take the time to actually name what was hard this year, what was a low point. Give it space to be acknowledged, not to wallow in the sadness of it, but just to appropriately grieve the losses or hard moments of this past year. Number 3, who were the people you are most grateful for this past year and why? I think a year like this one has made us more grateful than ever for the people in our lives. Yes, there have been moments of strain as you've probably had to be with the same people in the same space for long periods of time. But even in the midst of all of that, we are grateful that we have our people. Maybe your spouse or kids, family and friends, your church community, your coworkers. Think of the people that have walked with you through this difficult year and why you were grateful for them. Question 4, what events or dates stand out in your mind from this year? So maybe look through your calendar and just kind of glance through just to remind yourself, what did I actually do this year? Even though this year there was probably more things that were canceled than actually happened, there are probably some things that happened that are worth noting and remembering. Number 5, what accomplishment or success are you proud of from this year? You might think about work or family life or home, whatever stands out. Maybe you finally decluttered your closet, or you grew your business, or maybe you spent more intentional time with your kids. It doesn't have to be big. Maybe in the year 2020, the biggest accomplishment is that you kept going and you didn't give up. And that is a huge thing to get accomplished for this year. Number 6, what is something left undone this past year that you wish you'd made time for? So there are probably a lot of things you plan to do this year that didn't happen. And this question is not made to make you feel guilty about that, but just simply to notice, what do I wish I had actually gotten done? Before you move forward, noticing this can help you know what to do next. Number 7, what did God teach you or form in you this past year? So think about your life with God. How have you grown or what have you learned? For many of us, our answer probably has to do with growing in faith or trust in God, even when life is uncertain. God might be forming patience in you or compassion for others, or it might be something tangible you can point to. Maybe you started reading the Bible more regularly, or you carved out more space for prayer or silence. So the next few questions are actually about the pandemic, just to kind of specifically reflect on that event from this year. Number 8 is, when did the seriousness of the pandemic first become real to you? Now, this might be something weird or small or silly or something significant. For me, it was when I realized that we were low on toilet paper and everywhere was sold out. And as silly and minor as that may seem, the fact that something as simple as toilet paper might not be readily available definitely got my attention. Number 9 is, what did a typical day look like during lockdown when everyone was at home? Think about working from home or your kids doing school at home or how you filled all the time together. Acknowledge the hard parts of being together when all that togetherness was a little too much, but also think about the gift of time with each other and maybe what that formed in your family. This was such a unique time, and I think it's worth remembering those small, everyday ways that it looked in our daily lives. The final question, number 10, is, what unexpected thing did you learn or do because of the lockdown or pandemic? So it might be something super practical or tangible. Some people took the time to pick up a new skill like baking bread, or maybe you made more time to read, or you tackled a home project you'd been putting off. Or it might be that you learned how busy life was before and that you actually enjoyed the slower pace. But take some time to think about what you learned in this season, or what you had time for that you simply couldn't fit in when life was more full of activity. So I hope that these questions help you spend just a few minutes looking back on this year before you move on to the next one. Reflecting on our lives can show us how we've grown, what we need to do next, and they can help us see the story God is telling in and through our lives. As you reflect, ask God to show you what He wants you to see. I know we're probably all anxious to move on to the next year, but before we do, let's take time to acknowledge both the good and the bad from last year, recognizing that all of it is forming something in us as we move ahead to the future. Thanks for joining me today for this episode of Simple Spiritual Practices. If you want to receive a free printable for each practice in a weekly email, visit lindsaysturkey.com/free to sign up. This podcast is part of the New Hope Podcast Network, and production is done by Darren Hansen. You can check out all the podcasts on the network by visiting newhopechurch.cc/listen. Make sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode, and we'll be back with a new episode next week.